She was forbidden to be there. But the billionaire's air was freezing. The maid's daughter shared the floor with him, sparking a reaction that changed everything. In a mansion vibrating with the wealth of a charity gala, a billionaire father is trapped, forced to smile, while watching his sick son shiver violently on a nursery camera 3 floors above. The boy, recovering from pneumonia, is alone in a room where the heating is broken. The paid professional charged with his care has ignored the danger, leaving him in the freezing cold. But another child is moving through the shadows. 10-year-old Sophie, the housekeeper's daughter, was ordered to stay hidden. Now, following a desperate sound, she is about to make a choice that will either save a life or destroy her own. And before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I hope you love this story. A broken thermostat was about to change 2 families forever. Mark Copeland stared at the grainy security feed on his phone. Why was his son, David, huddled on the floor with the maid's daughter? The music from the charity gala vibrated through the marble floors of the Copeland mansion. Downstairs, hundreds of Seattle's wealthiest citizens mingled, sipping champagne and admiring the art. The event was in support of the Regional Children's Hospital, a cause Mark Copeland championed with mechanical precision. Mark himself stood near the grand staircase, his tuxedo perfect, his smile practiced. He nodded at a senator, shook hands with a banking executive, and felt utterly, profoundly alone. He hated these events. They were a necessary function of his life, a performance of wealth. But his mind was not on the donations. His mind was 3 floors up, in the East Wing, with his son. David was 8 years old. He was a quiet boy, small for his age, and still recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia that had hospitalized him 2 weeks prior. He was fragile, and Mark's wife, gone 3 years now, had left a void that Mark tried to fill with security staff, specialized tutors, and the best nannies money could buy. He allowed himself a brief moment of escape. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping the icon for the nursery cameras. His jaw tightened. The feed was clear. David was in his bed, but he was shivering violently, his knees drawn up to his chest. The expensive duvet was pulled around his waist. He looked small and afraid. "Where is she?" Mark muttered. He swiped to the hallway camera. Nothing. He checked the feed for the nanny's adjoining room. Empty. He tapped back to David's room just as the door opened. Miss Finch, the night nanny, bustled in. She was a stern woman in her 50s, highly recommended and highly paid. Mark watched on the small screen as Miss Finch walked over to the bed. She touched David's forehead, not with kindness, but with brisk efficiency. David whispered something, his voice too small for the camera's microphone to catch. Miss Finch nodded, walked to the wall, and tapped the digital thermostat. The display flashed briefly, 15 degrees Celsius, and then went dark. She tapped it again, frowning. Then, she seemed to give up. She pulled the thin duvet up to David's chin, patted his head twice, and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Mark Copeland stopped breathing. Rage, cold and sharp, flooded his system. The thermostat in the East Wing had been malfunctioning for days. He had told his sister, Jessica, to have it fixed immediately. Clearly, she had not. And Ms. Finch, trusted with his son's fragile health, had just left a sick child in a room that was rapidly becoming an icebox. He wanted to run. He wanted to sprint up the stairs and fire the woman on the spot. But he was trapped. The governor was approaching, hand extended, a wide, political smile on his face. Mark Copeland, billionaire philanthropist, had to perform. He put his phone back in his pocket, the image of his shivering son burning behind his eyes. Downstairs, in the brightly lit, humid chaos of the basement kitchen, Helen Miller wiped a stray piece of parsley from a silver tray. She was the head housekeeper, but tonight, she was also the emergency catering supervisor. The agency Mark's sister had hired was 2 servers short. "Trays out, now," Helen commanded, her voice firm but quiet. "Mr. Copeland wants the salmon puffs circulating." In a small, dry storage room just off the kitchen, 10-year-old Sophie Miller sat on an overturned bucket. Her blonde hair was tied back in a neat ponytail. She was reading a worn copy of The Secret Garden. Sophie was not supposed to be here, but the babysitter had canceled at the last minute, a sudden family emergency. Helen, a widow with no other options, had been forced to bring her daughter to work. "You stay here, Sophie," Helen had instructed, her eyes full of worry. "Do not leave this room. Do not make a sound." If Mrs. Copeland, Helen corrected herself, If Miss Copeland finds you, I could lose my job. Do you understand? Yes, Mama, Sophie had whispered. Sophie understood boundaries. Her whole life was defined by them. She and her mother lived in a small apartment across town, a world away from this palace of glass and stone. Her mother had taught her to be invisible, to clean up, not be cleaned up after, to be polite, and above all, to be quiet. But Sophie also carried another legacy. Tucked in her backpack, beside her book, was a small, framed photo of a man in a crisp uniform. This was her great-grandfather, General Michael Hayes. He was a war hero, a man who, according to her mother's stories, never backed down and never left anyone behind. Sophie, quiet and small, held that story of courage inside her like a secret light. An hour passed. The kitchen staff was frantic. Sophie was thirsty. She had drunk the small juice box her mother had packed. The storage room was becoming stuffy. She needed to use the restroom. She slipped out and found her mother near the service elevator. Mama, I need the bathroom. Helen looked panicked. The staff bathroom had a line of 3 waiters. Oh, Sophie, okay. Listen to me. She knelt, gripping Sophie's shoulders. Go up the service stairs to the 2nd floor. Not the main stairs, the service stairs. Turn right. There is a small guest bathroom by the linen closet. It's the one we clean. No one from the party will be up there. Be fast. Do not touch anything. And come right back. Yes, Mama. Sophie slipped into the narrow stairwell. She climbed the steps quickly, her sneakers silent on the concrete. The 2nd floor was a different world. The frantic energy of the kitchen was gone. Here, it was silent, the air still and cold. The thick carpet muffled her steps. The music from the gala was just a distant hum. She found the hallway Helen described. She passed grand, closed doors, the library, the study, Mr. Copeland's office. She was almost at the guest bathroom when she heard it. It wasn't a cry. It was a noise like dry leaves skittering, the sharp, desperate chattering of teeth. Sophie froze. Her mother's voice was loud in her head. Do not touch anything. Come right back. But the sound from her great-grandfather's stories was louder. You never leave a man behind. She followed the noise. It came from a room at the end of the hall, the door slightly open. She pushed it gently. The room was huge, dark, and freezing. A small boy was curled in a massive bed, shaking so hard the whole frame seemed to rattle. His face, visible in the moonlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows, was pale, his lips tinted a frightening shade of blue. This must be David, the boy her mother sometimes mentioned, the one who was always sick. Hello, Sophie whispered. David's eyes opened. He was too cold to speak. He just stared at her, his breathing shallow. Sophie, raised in drafty apartments where the heating was always a day late, knew this kind of cold. This was a dangerous cold. She ran to the wall and saw the thermostat. The screen was black. Dead. She looked back at the bed. The duvet was thick, but it wasn't enough. The cold air was pouring in from the massive, single-pane windows. Sophie knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that the warmest place in a cold room was never the bed. It was the floor, away from the drafts. We have to get you warm, she said, her voice gaining a sudden authority she didn't know she possessed. She went to the bed. I'm Sophie. My mom works here. You're too cold. David just shivered. He was weak. Sophie grabbed the heavy duvet and pulled it entirely off the bed, dragging it to the center of the room, onto the thick, plush wool rug. Can you walk? She asked. David shook his head. Sophie, small but wiry, put her arm around his back. Come on. We have to move. She half lifted, half dragged the frail boy from the bed. He whimpered, his skin like ice against hers. She settled him onto the duvet, then wrapped it tightly around him. It was still not enough. His teeth were still chattering. Sophie looked around. There were no other blankets. You have to share the heat, her mother had told her once, during a winter storm when their power went out. It's the only way. Sophie made a decision. She lay down on the rug beside David, right on the wool. She pulled the edges of the heavy duvet over both of them, creating a small, shared tent. Then, she pressed her own small, warm body against his back, wrapping one arm around him. It's okay, she whispered, her voice muffled in the fabric. My great-grandpa said you just have to hold on until the cavalry comes. We just have to hold on. David's shivering didn't stop, but it lessened. He leaned back into her warmth, a small, grateful sound escaping his chest. Sophie just held him, staring into the darkness, wondering if the cavalry was ever going to come, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that she was going to be in more trouble than she had ever been in her life. Mark Copeland had lasted exactly 7 minutes. The governor was mid-story about a fishing trip when Mark's patience snapped. "Governor, forgive me. My son." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked, fast, toward the grand staircase. Guests parted for him, their faces surprised. A billionaire host does not simply abandon his own party. "Mark? Mark, where are you going?" His sister, Jessica Copeland, hurried after him, her diamonds flashing. Jessica was a woman who valued appearances above all. Mark leaving his post was a social catastrophe. "The thermostat in David's room," Mark said, his voice a low growl as he took the stairs 2 at a time. "You were supposed to fix it." I called facilities," Jessica stammered, breathless as she tried to keep up. "They said it was a minor sensor issue." "Mark, what is this about?" Mark didn't answer. He was checking his phone again. The feed from David's room was static. The signal was weak. He shoved the phone back in his pocket and moved faster. He reached the second-floor landing and strode down the dark, silent hallway. Jessica was right behind him, huffing. "Mark, you are making a scene. What has gotten into?" Mark threw open the door to David's room. The scene before him stopped his heart. For a terrifying second, he couldn't process it. He saw a lump of blankets on the floor. He saw a flash of blonde hair. His first thought, primal and dark, was that something had happened. That someone had hurt his son. "David!" he yelled, lunging forward. Sophie gasped, scrambling out from under the blanket. She stumbled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror, her hands held up as if to ward off a blow. David, startled, tried to sit up, but was too weak. "Dad, what is going on here?" Mark demanded, his voice echoing in the cold room. "My goodness!" Jessica shrieked, finally catching up. She saw Sophie, in her simple jeans and sweater, standing over the shivering pile of blankets that held the Copeland heir. "You? What are you doing? Get away from him." Jessica grabbed Sophie's arm, her fingers biting into the girl's thin bicep. "Who are you?" Helen, who had been anxiously waiting by the service stairs, heard the shout. She ran down the hall, her heart pounding with dread. She stopped dead in the doorway, her face draining of all color. She saw Mark Copeland, his face like thunder. She saw Jessica, holding her daughter like a criminal. And she saw David, pale and sick, on the floor. "Ma'am, Sophie, what did you do?" Helen whispered, her job, her life, evaporating before her eyes. She was on the floor with him. Jessica accused. "Under the blanket. Heaven knows what she was." "I was cold," David whispered. The words, though quiet, cut through the panic. Mark, who had been frozen in a storm of confusion and anger, finally focused. He knelt beside his son. He touched David's cheek. It was icy. He looked at David's lips. Still blue. "I was so cold, Dad," David repeated, his teeth chattering. The heaters broke." Mark looked at the dead thermostat on the wall. He looked at the drafty windows. He looked at the thick wool rug. And then, he looked at Sophie. She was standing perfectly still, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes, but she was not crying. Jessica still had her arm, but Sophie's chin was up. "Speak," Mark commanded her, his voice softer now, but urgent. "He was shaking, sir," Sophie said, her voice trembling but clear. "I heard him from the hall. The room was too cold. The bed is by the window. I knew the floor would be warmer. The rug is wool." Mark looked at the blankets. "And you?" "You have to share the heat, sir," Sophie said simply, as if explaining the weather. "Or the cold winds. My great-grandpa taught my mom that." Mark looked from the 10-year-old girl to his sister, who was still gripping Sophie's arm in outrage. He looked at Helen, who looked like she was about to faint. And he looked at his son, who was still shivering, but was no longer blue. Mark Copeland made 3 decisions in less than 5 seconds. He pointed a finger at Jessica. "Let go of her. Now." Jessica, stunned, dropped Sophie's arm. He turned to Helen. "Your shift is over. You and your daughter will be staying here tonight. In the south guest wing. It's heated." Helen just stared, unable to comprehend. "Sir, and you?" Mark said, turning to Sophie. He regarded her for a long, silent moment. He saw her worn sneakers, her defiant posture, and the complete lack of fear in her eyes. "You," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "just saved my son's life." He turned back to his sister, and the cold fury returned. Find Miss Finch. Tell her to pack her bags. She has 10 minutes to be off this property before I call the police. Mark, Jessica gasped. You can't. I can, Mark said. Get out. All of you. Except Helen. And Sophie. Jessica, humiliated, stalked from the room. Mark scooped David up into his arms, blankets and all. He turned to Helen, who was rooted to the spot. Please, follow me. My son is cold, and I think your daughter is the only person in this entire house who knows what to do about it. It was a reaction that sent a shockwave through the entire home. It was not anger at the breach of protocol. It was not suspicion. It was raw, stunned gratitude. And for Mark Copeland, it was the beginning of a change that would unravel everything he thought he knew about worth, loyalty, and strength. Mark Copeland walked through his own home as if he had never seen it before. He carried David, who was wrapped in the heavy duvet, his small body finally relaxing as Mark's own body heat transferred to him. Helen and Sophie followed 2 steps behind, a silent, uncertain escort. Mama, Sophie whispered, her hand finding her mother's. I'm sorry. I heard him. Hush, Sophie. Not now. Helen breathed, her eyes fixed on Mr. Copeland's broad, tense back. Every step on the plush runner was a step closer to unemployment. She had broken the one rule she had sworn to uphold. She had allowed her daughter to be seen. Worse, to be involved. They left the cold, modern glass of the East Wing and entered the South Wing. This part of the mansion was older, built by Mark's grandfather. The walls were paneled in warm, dark wood. The air was soft and smelled faintly of old books and beeswax. Mark kicked open the door to the largest guest suite. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, lit hours ago by the evening staff in case a gala guest needed to rest. The room was awash of soft yellows and deep reds. Put him here, Mark ordered, gesturing to the 4-poster bed. Helen rushed forward, pulling back the silk comforter. Mark laid David down, unwrapping the duvet he'd been carried in. The boy was no longer shivering, but his skin was still mottled and pale. Helen, Mark said, his voice clipped, all business. Call Dr. Evans. His number is on the house directory. Tell him it is a code 1. He will understand. Yes, sir. Helen moved to the antique desk phone. Mark turned to Sophie. He hadn't really looked at her until now. He saw a small girl with serious, intelligent blue eyes. She was not wringing her hands. She was not crying. She was just watching him, her gaze steady. You, he said. Are you cold? Sophie shook her head. No, sir. I had my sweater. Right. Mark felt a strange, awkward energy. He was a man who dealt in numbers, in projections and acquisitions. He did not know how to talk to children, not even his own. He was good at providing, not at comforting. You said the floor? The rug, he said, more to himself than to her. How did you know that? Heat rises, sir, Sophie said quietly. But the cold from a window sinks. It's called convection. The cold air pushes the warm air up and flows across the floor. But a bed is high. The cold air goes right under it. It's like sleeping on a bridge. Mark stared at her. Convection. And the wool rug, Sophie added, gesturing to the one in this room. It's a good insulator. Better than wood. The cold gets trapped under it, but the top stays warm from the room. Helen was off the phone, her hand over the receiver. Dr. Evans is on his way, sir. 10 minutes. Thank you, Mark said, his eyes still on Sophie. Where did you learn about convection? My great-grandpa. He fought in the mountains in the war, Sophie said. He taught my mama how to survive in the cold. She taught me. Before Mark could reply, a vibration came from his pocket. He pulled out his phone. It was the gala coordinator. He silenced the call. Then another came. A text from the governor. Mark, hope all is well. Must depart. Let's connect next week. The party. He had forgotten. It was still happening, a sea of wealth and noise, 3 floors below them. And he was up here, in a warm room, with his half-frozen son and his housekeeper's daughter. Sir, Helen ventured, her voice trembling. About Miss Finch. And Sophie. I can't apologize enough. I told her to stay in the storage room. I only sent her to the staff bathroom. I never imagined. Mark held up a hand. The gesture was sharp, final. Helen, stop. Helen's mouth snapped shut. You will not apologize, Mark said, his voice low and intense. You will not apologize for your daughter doing what a $150,000 a year nanny failed to do. You will not apologize for her being smart, or for her being brave. He looked at Sophie. You disobeyed your mother. Sophie flinched, but she nodded. Yes, sir. You were told to come right back? You heard a noise, and you went toward it. Yes, sir. He sounded scared. And you were not. Sophie thought for a moment. She looked at her worn sneakers, then back at Mark. I was scared of getting in trouble. But David sounded cold. Cold is different. Cold can't wait. Trouble can. Mark Copeland felt the foundation of his world tilt. He paid people for their expertise. He paid for security, for medical care, for investment advice. He bought the best. Miss Finch was the best. His sister, who ran his household, was supposed to be the best. And they had all failed. The only person who had succeeded was a 10-year-old girl. A girl who understood the practical, brutal physics of survival. A girl who wasn't paid at all. Dr. Evans arrived, as promised, in under 10 minutes. He was a no-nonsense man who had been the Copeland family physician for 30 years. He entered the guest suite, took one look at the situation, Mark in his tuxedo, Helen in her black uniform, Sophie standing by the fire, and got to work. Pneumonia, then a chilled room. Not a good combination, Mark, he grumbled, listening to David's chest with a stethoscope. The nanny has been dealt with, Mark said tightly. Good. Dr. Evans checked David's temperature. 35.8 degrees Celsius. Low, but not dangerously so. He's warming up. The shivering has stopped. He looked at the boy, who was now awake and watching everyone with wide, tired eyes. You're a lucky boy, David. Getting this cold again. It could have set your recovery back weeks. We could have been looking at a relapse. Another hospital stay. Mark's blood ran cold. Another hospital stay. The weeks he had spent in that sterile white room, watching his son struggle for every breath, flashed before his eyes. But he's fine, Dr. Evans said, packing his bag. Thanks to... He looked at Sophie. This is Sophie Miller, Mark said, his voice thick. Helen's daughter. Oh. Dr. Evans smiled at her. Well, Sophie Miller, you have good instincts. Better than most. That floor and blanket trick probably saved him a trip to the ER. You want a job? Sophie blinked. I'm 10, sir. A joke, the doctor chuckled. Keep him warm. Broth in the morning. Let him sleep. He'll be perfectly fine by sunrise. The doctor left. Mark walked him to the service elevator. When he returned, the room had shifted. Helen was sitting on the edge of a velvet armchair, looking exhausted. Sophie, however, was not. She had taken charge. She had found a glass in the bathroom, filled it with water, and was holding it for David, who sipped weakly. Is that better? She asked. David nodded. It's still cold. I know, Sophie said. But the fire will warm the room soon. We just have to wait. David looked at her, his curiosity overcoming his exhaustion. Who are you? I'm Sophie. My mom's Helen. She's the housekeeper. Oh, David said. He had seen Helen, a quiet woman who appeared and disappeared, always cleaning. He had never seen Sophie. Why were you on the floor with me? To keep you warm, Sophie said. It's called buddy warming. My great-grandpa taught it. The soldier? David asked. Sophie's face lit up. She sat on the edge of the bed, a respectful distance from David. Yes, General Michael Hayes. He was very brave. From her backpack, which she had retrieved from the hallway, she pulled the small, silver-plated frame. She handed it to David. Mark stood in the shadows by the door, watching. David studied the photo. The man was young, in a sharp uniform, his chin high. He looked like he could command armies. He looked serious. He was, Sophie said. He fought in a place with mountains so high, the snow never melted. He said the cold was a worse enemy than the other soldiers. The cold was quiet, and it never slept. What happened? David whispered. One time, Sophie said, her voice dropping into a storyteller's rhythm. He and another soldier got trapped in a blizzard. Their radio was broken. They were in a little snow hole. The other man wanted to sleep. He said it was too cold to stay awake. But my great-grandpa knew that if you fall asleep in that kind of cold, you don't wake up. What did he do? He did what I did with you, Sophie said. He wrapped them both in one tarp. And he talked. He told the man stories all night long. Stories about home, about fishing, about his dog. He kept him awake until the sun came up and the rescue team found them. He saved his life just by sharing his heat and telling stories. David's eyes were heavy, but he was listening to every word. Wow. He always said, Sophie concluded, taking the photo back gently, that you don't need a big army to be a hero. You just need to see who's cold and share your blanket. David's eyes finally closed. He was asleep, his breathing deep, and even for the first time in weeks. Mark Copeland stood by the door, his heart aching. He, a man who commanded a global empire, had been trying to fix his son with machines, with nannies, with temperature-controlled wings. And this girl had fixed him with a wool rug and a story. He felt a profound, unsettling shame. The gala was winding down. The governor was gone. The major donors were collecting their coats. The night, from a financial perspective, had been a success. Jessica Copeland, however, was in a cold rage. Mark had not returned. He had dismissed her, his own sister, like a disobedient servant in front of a child. He had fired the best nanny in Seattle. He had installed the housekeeper in the family's private guest wing. It was a breach of protocol. It was a breach of class. She marched from the grand hall, her heels clicking angrily on the marble. The staff was cleaning up, and she saw Helen's purse and coat still by the service entrance. They were still here. She took the service elevator to the third floor, bypassing the south wing, and went straight to the east wing. She found Ms. Finch, her face pale and streaked with tears, zipping a suitcase. "Ms. Finch, this is a travesty," Jessica said, closing the door. "He just fired me," the nanny whispered, horrified. "The thermostat was broken. I put another blanket on him. What was I supposed to do? He was fine." "He was not fine," Jessica snapped. "He was cold. And you left him. But that's not the point. The point is, my brother has had an emotional overreaction. And he has been influenced by the housekeeper." "The housekeeper?" "Helen Miller. And her daughter. A strange, blonde child. They're in the south wing now. With my nephew." Miss Finch looked utterly bewildered. "What? Exactly?" Jessica's mind was working quickly. "Mark is not himself. He's stressed. Grieving. He's latching onto this heroic story. It's ridiculous. That girl was trespassing. She had no business being in this wing. She probably left the door open herself, made the room cold, and then played the hero to get sympathy. Or money. Do you really think so?" Miss Finch asked, desperate to believe it. "I am certain of it," Jessica lied. "These people, they see an opportunity. A single father, a sick son. It's a classic setup." She patted Miss Finch's arm. "You will go to the Grand Hyatt downtown. Build a room to the Copeland account. I will handle my brother in the morning. This is not over." "Thank you, Miss Copeland." "Thank you." Jessica nodded, her mind set. She would not let a 10-year-old girl and her mousy mother disrupt the order of this house. This was her house. Mark paid the bills, but she ran it. She marched down the hall to the south wing. She found the guest suite. The door was slightly ajar. She was about to barge in when she heard Helen's voice. "Sir, I must insist. We cannot stay here. It's not right. I can take Sophie home. The buses are running again. We will be fine. I'll come back in the morning for my duties." Jessica paused, listening. Good, she thought. At least the mother has some sense. Then she heard Mark's voice, as cold and clear as she had ever heard it. "Helen, I said you were staying. That was not a request. It was an order." "But, sir, my daughter." "Your daughter," Mark said, "is asleep in the armchair. She refused to take the other bed. She said it was too fancy." Jessica heard a soft, dry chuckle. It was Mark. He was laughing. "She is asleep," Mark continued, holding a backpack that contains a picture of a war hero, a man who understood duty. "Meanwhile, my son is asleep, in no danger, for the first time this month. And you want to take your daughter to a bus stop in the middle of the night? It's just, we don't belong here, sir." Helen's voice was full of anguish. "That," Mark said, his voice hardening, "is where you are wrong. Tonight, you and Sophie are the only two people in this entire godforsaken mansion who seem to belong anywhere. You will stay. You will sleep in the bed. Your daughter will sleep. That is the end of this discussion." Jessica Copeland backed away from the door, her face white with fury. He wasn't just grateful. He was impressed. He was charmed. This was no longer a simple breach of protocol. This was a threat to her position, to her authority, and to the very structure of the life she had built for herself. She returned to her own suite. She sat at her desk. She picked up the phone. She did not call the hotel. She called her lawyer. "Robert, it's Jessica Copeland," she said, her voice smooth as ice. "I need you to run a background check. A full one. Helen Miller. And her daughter, Sophie. And I want to know everything you can find about a man named General Michael Hayes." "Yes. I'll wait." Sophie Miller woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She sat up. Her neck was stiff. Across the room, her mother was standing by the window, dressed in the same black uniform as last night. She had not slept in the bed. She had, Sophie knew, sat in the other armchair, watching over her and the boy in the bed. "Mama," Sophie whispered, untangling her legs. Helen turned, her face etched with a familiar, bone-deep weariness. But when she saw Sophie, her expression softened into a sad smile. "Good morning, sunshine. You slept." "You didn't," Sophie observed. "I rested my eyes," Helen said, a phrase that always meant she hadn't slept at all. In the massive four-poster bed, David Copeland stirred. He sat up, his hair a mess, his cheeks flushed with healthy, warm color. He looked worlds better than the shivering child on the floor. "Good morning," David said shyly. He looked at Helen, then at Sophie. I'm hungry." As if summoned, there was a soft knock on the door. It wasn't a sharp, impatient rap. It was a hesitant, polite knock. Helen smoothed her apron, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Enter." Mark Copeland walked in. He was not the imposing man in the tuxedo. He wore a simple, dark gray cashmere sweater and slacks. His hair was slightly damp, as if from a recent shower. He was holding a large silver tray, laden with food. It was so unexpected that Helen froze. Mr. Copeland did not carry trays. I assumed you'd be hungry," Mark said, his voice quiet. He looked awkward, like a man performing a task for the very first time. He set the tray on a low coffee table in front of the fireplace. "Mr. Copeland, sir, you shouldn't have," Helen stammered, rushing forward. "That's my job. I can go to the kitchen." "Helen," Mark said, not unkindly. "Please, sit. Eat." He looked at his son. "How do you feel, David?" "Good," David said. "Warm. And Sophie's here." "Yes." Mark turned his gaze to Sophie, who was now standing by her chair, her hands clasped behind her back. "Sophie." "Sir," she replied. Mark felt that same, strange awkwardness. He cleared his throat. I have spent the last few hours thinking about what to say to you." "Thank you seems small. It doesn't cover what you did." "I just helped him get warm, sir," Sophie said. "No, you did more than that," Mark said, his voice gaining intensity. "You did what an entire household of paid professionals failed to do. You paid attention. You acted. You were brave." He reached into his pocket. He was a man who solved problems with money. It was the only tool he had ever truly mastered. He pulled out a checkbook and a pen. "I want to reward you, Sophie," he said, moving to the desk. "I want to set up a fund for your education. College." Helen's breath hitched. "Sir, no. We can't accept that. It's not for you." "Helen," Mark said, turning. "It's for her." He looked at Sophie, his pen poised over the check. "Whatever you want. Name the amount. A new house. A car for your mother. Your college, paid in full. It's done." It was the ultimate test. He was offering her a kingdom. Sophie looked at the checkbook. She looked at her mother, whose face was pale with a mix of shock and temptation. She looked at David, who was watching her with open curiosity. Then she looked back at Mark Copeland. "No, thank you, sir," she said. Mark's hand stopped moving. "What? I can't take money for that," Sophie said, her voice clear and small in the grand room. "Sophie, don't be ridiculous," Helen whispered, mortified. "Sir, she's just a child. She doesn't understand." "I do understand," Sophie insisted, her chin rising. She was not being rude. She was being clear. "My great-grandpa, General Hayes, he got a medal for what he did in the mountains. For saving that man in the blizzard." "He did," Mark said, intrigued. "My mama told me the president gave it to him. But the man he saved, the soldier, he was rich. His family owned railroads. He tried to give my great-grandpa a house. A big one." "And did he take it?" Mark asked, slowly putting the pen down. "No, sir," Sophie said. "He sent it back. He told the man, 'You don't pay a man for doing his duty. You just say thank you, and you do your duty next time.' He said that's what holds the world together. Doing your duty." She took a small breath. "I wasn't doing my duty because I was in a place I wasn't supposed to be. But David was cold, and he was scared. So I shared my blanket. You don't get paid for that. It's just what you do." Mark Copeland sat down heavily in the armchair opposite Sophie. He set the checkbook on the table, next to the platter of bacon, and stared at the 10-year-old girl. He had spent his entire adult life in boardrooms, navigating a world of leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, and quid pro quo. Everything had a price. Every action had a motive. He understood greed, ambition, and fear. He did not, he realized, understand this. This clear, simple, unshakable code. He taught you well, Mark said, his voice rough. He taught my mama, Sophie corrected. She taught me. A small, comfortable silence fell. David, seeing the tension had passed, pointed to Sophie's backpack. Can you read to me? From your book. My book? Sophie asked. The one from last night. The Secret Garden. Oh. Sophie pulled the worn paperback from her bag. I guess so. If it's okay with your dad. Mark nodded, his eyes never leaving her. It's okay. Sophie sat on the edge of the thick wool rug, a safe distance from the bed, but close enough for him to hear. She opened the book to the first chapter. Her name was Mary Lennox, Sophie began, her voice gaining confidence. When she was first sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. Mark watched. He watched his son, who was usually so withdrawn and anxious, visibly relax. David's eyes were fixed on Sophie, his body uncurling from its usual defensive posture. He was listening, truly listening. And Mark listened, too. He listened to the story of a lonely, unloved child finding a locked, dead garden and, in the process, finding herself. He looked at Sophie, a girl who seemed to carry her own secret garden of strength and honor, inherited from a soldier he'd never met. He looked at Helen, who was now quietly pouring coffee for him, her hands steady. She was a good woman. He paid her to clean his toilets. He had never once asked her name. A profound, sickening realization settled on him. He wasn't the master of this house. He was its prisoner. He was trapped in a world of surfaces, of nannies who didn't care and sisters who managed but did not feel. He was, he thought, just as locked away as the children in the story. The spell was broken by the sharp, authoritative click of heels in the hallway. The door swung open without a knock. Jessica Copeland stood in the doorway, her face a mask of polite, controlled fury. She was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored business suit. She held a black leather satchel in one hand and a manila folder in the other. Mark. Finally, she said, her voice like chilled steel. I've been trying to reach you all morning. The gala committee is in an uproar. You simply vanished. I was with my son, Jessica, Mark said, his voice flat. He stood up. The brief, warm peace of the room evaporated. Yes, so I see. Jessica's eyes swept the scene. She registered the food tray, Helen pouring coffee, and Sophie sitting on the floor with a book. Her lip curled in a tiny, almost imperceptible sneer. How cozy, she said. What do you want, Jessica? What I want, she said, is to protect this family. To protect you. From your own worst impulses, apparently. She strode into the room and dropped the manila folder onto the coffee table, right on top of Mark's open checkbook. I took the liberty, Jessica said, loud enough for Helen and Sophie to hear every word, of having my lawyer do some research last night. On our guests. Helen, who had been holding the coffee pot, set it down with a clatter. Her hand flew to her mouth. Jessica, that is enough, Mark warned. Oh, is it? Jessica snapped. You're about to write a check for God knows how much to a woman you know nothing about. Based on a story a 10-year-old told you. I thought you were a better businessman than that, Mark. She tapped the folder. Or perhaps you just like the story. What is in that folder? Mark demanded. The truth, Jessica said, which is something these people seem to find flexible. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. Helen Miller. Widow. One child, Sophie. No criminal record. Standard. Boring. She pulled out a second sheet. But the story, Mark. The war hero. The general. That's where it gets interesting. Sophie, who had been frozen on the floor, stood up. You stop, she whispered. Don't you talk about him. Oh, I will, Jessica said, smiling a cold, thin smile. There was no General Michael Hayes. Not one who fought in the mountains. Not one who won the medal you're so proud of. Helen looked like she had been struck. That's a lie. Is it? Jessica tossed the paper onto the table. He was Private Michael Hayes. A supply clerk. He was stationed at a training base in Washington State for his entire service. He never left the country. He never saw combat. He was discharged. Honorably, yes, but for nervous instability. He wasn't a hero, Mark. He was a clerk. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Sophie's face was white. No, no, that's not true. He was a hero. He saved a man. He told stories, dear. Jessica said, her voice laced with false pity. That's what men like that do. They invent a past to cover up a pathetic present. He was a failed supply clerk who told his family tall tales. And his family, apparently, she shot a venomous look at Helen, decided to use those tall tales to scam their way into a better life. How dare you? Helen whispered, her entire body shaking. You wicked woman. I am a practical woman, Jessica retorted. I am the one who protects this family from grifters and liars. I am the one who keeps order. She turned to Mark, her expression triumphant. She's a fraud, Mark. The whole story is a lie. A fabrication designed to prey on your emotions. To get you to open your checkbook. And you fell for it completely. Mark looked at the paper. He looked at Jessica's smiling, victorious face. He looked at Helen, who was openly weeping, humiliated. And then he looked at Sophie. She was not crying. Her small fists were clenched at her sides. Her blue eyes were blazing with a fire that was almost frightening. You're the liar, Sophie said, her voice shaking but powerful. Sophie, hush, Helen sobbed, grabbing her daughter's arm. We're leaving. We are leaving right now. No, Mark said. His voice was a dead calm rumble that silenced the entire room. He had not looked at the papers. He had not looked at his sister. He was looking only at Sophie. Mark, Jessica began, don't be a fool. The evidence is right. I said no, Mark repeated. He walked over to the coffee table. He picked up the manila folder and, without opening it, dropped it into the fireplace. The flames licked at the edges, and it began to brown. What are you doing? Jessica shrieked. That's the proof. I don't need proof, Mark said, turning to face his sister. I have my son, sleeping and healthy, in that bed. I have a nanny who I paid 6 figures, who left him to freeze. And I have a 10-year-old girl who told me, you don't get paid for duty. He pointed at the burning folder. I don't care what is in that file. I don't care if he was a general or a clerk. I don't care if he fought in the mountains or on a typewriter. It doesn't matter. How can you say it doesn't matter? Jessica cried, her composure cracking. Because he taught her, Mark said, pointing at Sophie. Whatever he was, whatever he did, he taught her mother, who taught her honor. He taught her that you don't leave a man to freeze. He taught her that you share your blanket. He taught her something that you and I, his voice was full of self-loathing, have apparently never learned. You can't buy that, Jessica. And you can't fake it. Mark, you are making a terrible mistake, Jessica said, her voice low and threatening. No, Mark said. My mistake was letting this house be run by a clerk. Someone who manages the accounts but has no idea what's valuable. He looked at Helen, who was staring at him, dumbfounded. Helen, I apologize, he said, his voice sincere. I apologize for my sister's cruelty. I apologize for her, for this. It will not happen again. He turned back to Jessica. You're done, Jessica. Your services are no longer required. Pack your things. Be out of my house by noon. Jessica Copeland's face collapsed. The triumphant mask shattered, revealing a raw, gaping terror. Mark, no. You don't mean that. This is my home. It's my home, Mark corrected. And it's my son's. And you have failed us both. You are exactly like Miss Finch. You saw a problem, and you looked the other way. Worse, you attacked the person who fixed it. Get out. Jessica stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. She looked at Helen. She looked at Sophie. The hatred in her eyes was pure, undiluted. She said nothing. She turned, her back rigid, and walked out of the room. The click of her heels faded down the hall, a sound of final, sharp defeat. Mark let out a breath he felt he had been holding for years. He turned back to the room. Helen was trying to wipe her tears. David was sitting up in bed, looking confused. And Sophie was walking to the fireplace. She knelt. The folder was now a black, bubbling square. She looked at it, her expression unreadable. Ma'am, she said to her mother, her voice very small. Yes, baby. Is it true? What she said. About great-grandpa. Helen's heart broke. She knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. Oh, Sophie. It's complicated. So he wasn't a general? Sophie whispered, the first tear tracing a path down her dusty cheek. No, honey. He wasn't, Helen admitted, her voice thick with old shame. He was a clerk. And he was nervous. The war scared him. He never went overseas. So the story? The blizzard? The soldier? That story, Helen said, pulling back to look her daughter in the eyes, was true. But it didn't happen in the mountains. It happened in Seattle. During the big freeze of '52. He wasn't a soldier. He was a volunteer. At a shelter. And the man he saved wasn't a soldier. He was a homeless man. But he did save him. He did sit with him all night. He did share his heat. The rest, the general part, that was just a story he told. A story he told himself, so he could feel brave. Sophie processed this. The grand, shining image of her hero, the man in the crisp uniform, dissolved. It was replaced by a small, nervous man in a drafty shelter, sharing a blanket with a stranger. She looked at her mother. He was still a hero, wasn't he? Yes, baby. Helen wept, hugging her daughter tight. Yes, he was. He was the best man I ever knew. Mark Copeland stood by the window, watching them. He had just fired his sister, upended his entire life, and defended a story that had just been admitted as a lie. And he felt, for the first time in his life, that he had done exactly the right thing. The room was quiet for a long time. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire as it consumed Jessica's folder and the muffled sobs of Helen, holding her daughter. Mark Copeland stood by the window, the morning light hitting his face. He looked tired, older, but the hard, restless energy was gone. He looked, for the first time, at peace. He turned from the window. Helen was on her knees, her arms wrapped around Sophie, who was still staring at the fire, her face streaked with tears and soot. Helen, Mark said, his voice gentle. Helen looked up, her eyes red. She quickly tried to compose herself, to stand, to become the invisible housekeeper again. Mr. Copeland, we will pack our things. I am so sorry. For the lie. For all of it. There was no lie, Mark said. Helen and Sophie both stared at him. But, I told you, Helen whispered. He was a clerk. He made up the general part. It was a story. He told a story about being a hero, Mark said, walking over to them. He knelt, an act so foreign to him that his knees cracked. He was now eye level with Sophie. And that story made you, his great-granddaughter, brave enough to save my son's life. That is not a lie, Sophie. That is a legacy. A story that powerful. It's the truest thing in the world. Sophie looked from her mother to this powerful man, who no longer seemed scary. He just seemed sad. Your great-grandfather was a hero, Mark said. It doesn't matter what his rank was. It doesn't matter if the battle was in the mountains or in a shelter. He saw someone was cold. He shared his blanket. That is the beginning and the end of the story. Do you understand? Sophie nodded, a small, shaky movement. Good. Mark stood up. He looked at Helen. My sister is gone. Miss Finch is gone. My son is safe. This house is a mess, Helen. It's a cold, perfectly managed, empty place. It has been for years. I have been running it like Jessica. On paper. By the numbers. He motioned around the grand, beautiful, lifeless room. I don't need a housekeeper. I have a dozen of those. They dust. They polish. And they would have let my son freeze, just like Miss Finch did, because they were afraid of breaking a rule. Because they were afraid of Jessica. Sir, I don't understand, Helen said. I am offering you a new position, Mark said. I am not. I am not asking you to stay. I am begging you to stay. I want you to run this house. Not as a housekeeper. As the estate manager. Helen's jaw dropped. Sir? That's your sister's job. It's a corporate position. It manages budgets, staff, everything. And you think you can't do it? Mark asked. I clean floors. I have a high school diploma. You have raised a daughter who, at 10 years old, has more courage, honor, and practical intelligence than my entire executive board. Mark said, his voice firm. You raised her on that story. The story of duty. That is what I want in this house. I want that to be the new rule. Duty. Compassion. Not fear. The salary will be triple what my sister was. Paying herself. And, of course, you and Sophie will live here. In this wing. It's warm. Helen looked at him, speechless. She was being offered a new life. A life of safety. A life of respect. But, Mr. Copeland, Helen said, one last tremor of fear in her voice. Your sister, she won't just leave. She's your family. No, Mark said, looking at David, who was watching them all, his dark eyes wide. He is my family. You and Sophie, you saved my family. My sister is just a person I happen to be related to. He offered his hand. not as a boss, but as a partner. Will you help me, Helen? Will you help me make this house a home? Helen looked at her daughter. Sophie, her face clearing, gave a small, firm nod. Helen took Mark's hand. Yes, Mr. Copeland. I will. Later that day, Mark sat alone in his vast, silent study. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded. He was left with the cold, hard wreckage of his life. He had fired his sister. He had essentially adopted his housekeeper's family. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer. Mark, what in God's name is going on? The lawyer's voice tinny. Jessica just called me. Hysterical. Said you've lost your mind. She's threatening to contest her removal from the household corporation. She's citing mental instability. Mark leaned back in his leather chair. He looked out the window. The sky was a clear, cold blue. She's welcome to try, Robert, Mark said, his voice perfectly calm. Send her a severance package. A generous one. And send her the bill from Dr. Evans. And a copy of the security footage from David's room. The footage of Ms. Finch abandoning my sick son in a 15-degree room. The room my sister was supposed to have fixed. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Ah, the lawyer said. The footage. I see. That changes the instability narrative. Yes, Mark said. It does. Handle it. He hung up. He knew Jessica. She was a bully, but she was not stupid. She would not risk that footage becoming public. She would take the money and go. She would vanish. His other line rang. It was the head of his security team. Sir, you asked for a report on a private Michael Hayes, service 1950 to 1953. Yes, Mark said. The report Ms. Copeland pulled was thin. It was a simple database search. She was right about the basics. He was a supply clerk at Fort Lewis. He never deployed. He was discharged for what they called anxiety neurosis back then. Today, we'd call it a severe anxiety disorder. Go on, Mark said. But I dug deeper, sir. Like you asked. The nervous instability? It wasn't from combat. He was unfit for service because he had a conscience. He filed 3 official complaints against his quartermaster for selling blankets, boots, and medical supplies on the black market. Supplies that were meant for the new recruits. He was railroaded, sir. His superiors labeled him a troublemaker and had him pushed out on a medical discharge. He was telling the truth. The quartermaster was convicted 2 years later. Mark closed his eyes. So, the man was a hero. He wasn't just a clerk. He was a whistleblower. He had sacrificed his own simple career for his duty. And the story, sir, the security chief continued. The Blizzard of 52. We found it. An old article from the Tacoma News Tribune. Local volunteer saves destitute man. It was him. He was volunteering at the Trinity shelter. He and a homeless man, a veteran, were trapped when a pipe burst and the furnace failed. They were found the next morning, huddled in one tarp. Just like the girl said. Mark felt a profound, aching respect for a man he had never met. A man who, defeated by a system that punished honor, had gone on to be honorable anyway. Thank you, Mark said, his voice thick. That's all. He sat for a moment. Then he left his study. He did not go to the boardroom. He did not check the markets. He went to the South Wing guest suite. It was no longer a guest suite. It was, by his order, the new permanent residence of Mrs. Miller and her daughter. He knocked. Sophie opened the door. Hello, sir. Sophie, he said. He looked past her. Helen was on the phone, already, respectfully, managing the kitchen staff. David was on the floor, his homework spread out. Dad, David said, scrambling up. Look, Sophie's teaching me how to draw a map. For the secret garden. Mark looked. It was a childish, charming drawing of walls and gardens. I see that, Mark said. He knelt. He was getting better at it. Sophie, I have a confession. I did what my sister did. I had your great-grandfather investigated. Helen hung up the phone, her face tightening with worry. Sophie just looked at him, waiting. Your mother was right, Mark said. He was a clerk. But he was also a hero. He was kicked out of the army because he tried to stop a bad man from stealing supplies from other soldiers. He chose his duty over his job. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. But this time, they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of pride. And the story about the shelter, Mark continued. It was true. All of it. He was a good man, Sophie. A very, very good man. He just didn't have a very good rank. He was a general, Sophie whispered, wiping her eyes. In his heart. Yes, Mark said. He was. Mark felt, in that moment, the full, crushing weight of his own wealth. He could buy anything. He could buy companies. He could buy politicians. But he could not buy a legacy like that. But he could honor one. 3 weeks later, the house was transformed. The staff, who had lived in fear of Jessica's sharp tongue and arbitrary rules, were still quiet, but they were no longer afraid. Mrs. Miller, Helen, was firm, but she was fair. She knew their names. She knew their families. She ran the house not like a machine, but like a community. David was thriving. The pneumonia was a distant memory. His new tutor, hired by Helen, was a kind, older woman who specialized in creative learning. He and Sophie were inseparable. They did homework together in the vast library. They explored the gardens. David, the quiet, fragile boy, was learning to laugh. Mark Copeland had also changed. He had not attended a single gala. He had, instead, come home at 5 o'clock every evening. One afternoon, he came home early. He found Helen, Sophie, and David in the small conservatory, a glass room filled with wintering orchids. "Sophie," he said, smiling, "I have something for you." He was not carrying a checkbook. He was carrying a large, flat, velvet-wrapped object. "This," he said, "is not a payment or a reward. It is an acknowledgement." He unwrapped it. It was a large, bronze plaque. At the top, it read, "The Private Michael Hayes Foundation for Civic Duty. In memory of Private Michael Hayes, 1928 to 1985, a man who understood that true honor is not found in rank or title, but in the courage to do what is right, and in the compassion to share your blanket with those who are cold. This foundation is hereby dedicated to funding and rebuilding the shelters of Seattle, ensuring no one is left in the cold again. Funded by the Copeland Family Trust." Sophie read the words. Her hand went to her mouth. "The old Trinity shelter was torn down years ago," Mark explained, his voice soft. "We're building a new one. In his name. The real him. So his story, his true story, will never be forgotten." Helen was crying openly, her hands clasped to her chest. Sophie stepped forward. She touched the cold, raised letters of her great-grandfather's name. She looked at Mark Copeland. "He would have liked this," she said, her voice full of a solemn, adult grace. "He would have liked that you told the truth." "Thank you, Mr. Copeland." "No, Sophie," Mark said. He looked at her, and at his son, who was standing beside her, smiling. "Thank you." That evening, the fire was lit in the library. Mark, David, Helen, and Sophie were all there. Helen was reading the paper. Mark was supposed to be reviewing a merger report. But David interrupted the silence. "Dad, will you read to us?" Mark looked up, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," Sophie said. "We finished The Secret Garden. We're starting a new one." She held up a thick book. "Treasure Island." Mark looked at the book. He looked at the dense pages. He had not read a children's story aloud since. "Well, ever. I'm not very good at it," he said. "That's okay," David said, moving to sit on the rug at his feet. "You just have to try." Mark Copeland, billionaire, philanthropist, and master of the universe, put his merger report on the floor. He took the book from Sophie. He cleared his throat, his voice awkward. Chapter 1. The Old Sea Dog at the Admiral Benbow. His voice was stiff at first. He read the words, but not the music. But as he looked at the two children, their faces wrapped in the firelight, he relaxed. He remembered the story his security chief had told him. A nervous man, in a dark, cold place, telling stories all night to keep a stranger alive. Mark took a breath. He changed his voice for Billy Bones. He put a growl into it. David giggled. Sophie's eyes widened. Mark Copeland smiled, and he read on. He was no longer performing. He was not a boss. He was not a host. He was just a man. He was a father. And in a warm room, surrounded by his small, strange, new family, he was finally sharing his blanket. And that's where we'll leave them, in the warmth of that fire-lit room. My hope in sharing this story is that it gave you a chance to step away from the everyday and remember that the smallest act of kindness, like sharing a blanket in a cold room, can be the catalyst for the greatest change. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Were you settling in with a cup of tea, or just taking a quiet moment for yourself? Drop a line in the comments. I truly read them all. If you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.